How are you, man? I'm Gil Roth, and you're listening to a bonus episode of my Virtual Memory Show podcast. This is a COVID check-in episode where I record with a past guest of the Virtual Memory Show to find out how they're holding up during the pandemic. As far as how I'm doing, I'm okay. It's Friday morning. Woke up an hour earlier than usual, which is crazy early as far as you guys are concerned anyway. So when I took my walk around the yard in the dark and the fog, the birds were still asleep. I heard them start to rally when I was having my morning coffee right after that, so all's right in the world. It's May Day, so if you're listening to this in real time, and for God's sake, who does, maybe spare a thought for labor and the notion of essential personnel. I've been kind of delving into that the last couple of conversations as I've grown more and more bitter, I guess. But we'll get to that, and maybe I'll pull out of that whole spiral in the next couple of days. Meanwhile, let's get to today's guest. David M. Carr is joining me this time from Putnam Valley, New York. David's a biblical scholar who teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, although he's on sabbatical this semester. He wrote one of the more fascinating books I've read for the podcast, Holy Resilience, The Bible's Traumatic Origins, from Yale University Press. It's about how episodes of trauma and communal catastrophe shape both the Torah and the Gospels. Rather than like celebrations of great victories, the central stories are about disaster for both Judaism and Christianity, and how the community processes them, and what those stories permit, I guess, in terms of allowing a community to come to terms with everything that went wrong. So I thought that means David would be a perfect guest to help us work through the pandemic and how we're dealing or not dealing with it through all of our different modes of storytelling and all of our behavior. That said, I had no idea so much of our conversation would revolve around Tiger King, but life takes you in some funny directions. As caveats go, David's mic was a little bit low, so Zencastr, the website I use for hosting, I had it run a post-production wave over it just to see if it would be better than what I do to the file in Audition. So it's a little louder, and maybe a little more crackly, whatever. You'll deal. And here's me and David. How are you doing?
I always feel a little ambivalent as I answer this question, because I think compared to so many people right now, I am doing great.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in a safe place in a beautiful forest. You've come here.
Yeah, I was going to ask, are you still in that house? Because it's such a idyll, basically.
Yeah. So I am at this house. Unlike normally, I'm at this house 24/7 every day, as opposed to it being my long weekend retreat. But I'm so lucky to have it and be with my wife, and one of our 4 kids is living with us, as has happened for many families. So we've been having to negotiate being back together in a close quarters over a period of weeks, but that's gone well. And I just sort of desperately miss being actually in the bodily presence of other human beings and being able to interact with them. But by the standards of the troubles today, that's pretty small.
Yeah, we all talk about those first world problems, and it's clear that we're privileged compared to a lot of others. Did you find it, given that we're talking about 6 or 7 weeks into when things started to get hairy, any sort of transition process for you in terms of recognizing these are now the parameters physically of life?
Well, I went, like everybody has their story. And for me, I was in the midst of a 2-month-long trip to Europe when things really started to get more intense. And so I'd already done lectures at several universities in Britain, and I had visited my stepson in northern Spain, which was actually one of the first places that had major outbreaks in Europe. And then traveled to Majorca to meet some friends. And 5 days into that trip, President Trump announced that he was closing down all travel back to the U.S. It turned out, in retrospect, he was only closing it down for non-U.S. nationals, but it was
one of the most poorly positioned speeches I've ever seen. That night, March 11th, was my moment of, oh my God, we are so screwed.
Yeah.
Because the NBA and other stuff all happened, but the idea that he could miss or screw up that message that badly on the fly, panicking Americans overseas. Ugh.
So I was one of those Americans, and I was already really thinking I needed to cut my trip short, and that decided it. And so I flew right home, and within a few hours of me getting in, we all loaded up the car and came up here and self-quarantined for 14 days because we'd all been in pretty high-risk areas for a while. But so far, we're all at least symptom-free and just trying to put one foot in front of the other and find nice minutes amidst this whole process.
Yeah, my wife and I were in Japan the middle of February, and things were starting to go up in smoke then. And we came back. We're still convinced we're somehow both asymptomatic and got by just fine. But there's that degree of just not knowing, I guess, what's inside you, which I guess turns into a horror movie trope or something like that. Do you feel how much do you feel your lifetime of study in Torah and gospel has helped or hindered you in the going through this whole process? Which I know is an overbroad question. I understand, but
well, we met each other talking about my book on
trauma and catastrophe,
and I'm thinking, boy, I really didn't time that book ideally, because it certainly seems to apply even more now. And in the meantime, since we talked about that book, I've been working a lot on the first chapters of the book of Genesis, which tell stories of creation and flood. And especially the stories of flood, I've become convinced were written in the context of trauma. They were sort of an indirect way for the ancient Israelites to talk about world catastrophe. And so I find as I read those stories in light of this experience, there are a lot of resonances, and I don't always feel great about the way that story works with these issues. But there's a lot going on there.
Can you elaborate a little without giving away the book? No spoiler alerts, of course.
Well, yeah, most people die and just a few live in the midst of that story.
That'll do it.
But yeah, I mean, the flood stories of the Bible originate from a culture in Mesopotamia that endured catastrophic floods on a somewhat regular basis as the snow melts happened in the mountains to the north of Mesopotamia. And so flood was the way those cultures talked about a catastrophe that seemed like it was possibly going to overwhelm them. And the flood stories that they told were about how the gods decided to impose that kind of catastrophe on humans. And then one particularly clever god who kind of cared about humans provided a means for some form of survival. And at the end of it, the gods realize they can't do without humans after all, and they won't ever send another flood. So the Israelites underwent massive experiences of trauma at the hands of various Mesopotamian superpowers and got to know some of the texts that were important to those ancient empires, like the flood stories that they told. And it's interesting that the Israelites decided to sort of appropriate their own version of such Mesopotamian flood stories to process their own experience of trauma. They didn't themselves experience such floods. Israel's a hill country culture that just doesn't have big rivers that tend to flood. But they still told stories about a world catastrophe flood where all life dies and God rescues one family and realizes God can't ever do without humans again and promises not to send that kind of catastrophe ever again. So it's sort of a near-death experience for all life on Earth, and so it's another place where you see in the Bible people talking about trauma by not talking about it. They're not talking about their experiences of massive death, imprisonment, enslavement, and disease amidst the invasions of the Mesopotamians, but instead they're talking about a flood. And maybe that's the way people often need to, work out their experiences of trauma. Nowadays, people watch Netflix or Tiger King or that.
Yeah, I was going to say Tiger King is the common answer that every guest has given me.
Yeah, but isn't it interesting, that in a time where many of us are confining ourselves to our homes, people are so interested in a story about the caging of wild cats, and then also the caging of some of the protagonists in that story who are human. It's a story of caging and that sort of thing. And so I think people work out their issues and experience of trauma. They often ideally want to do that through things that aren't about that trauma itself. They're indirect.
And do you feel we're talking about the right traumas? We're talking about traumas in any, I guess, my way of working this stuff out seems to be the people like us who are able to get by hidden away, and the class divide with the people who actually have to be out there doing all the quote unquote essential work, who we're, putting in harm's way so they can do our Amazon deliveries and everything else. Sorry, I'm meandering on my own on this one. I apologize,
no,
but it's something I've been pondering a lot lately.
Well, I think we were talking around it some when you asked me how I was doing, and
yeah,
I would want to say, if I was honest, I'm kind of sad. I cry at random times. Yeah. I have really low times and all that sort of thing. But when I consider this amidst this broader picture that you briefly alluded to, it feels so trite and worthless for me to talk about whatever that I'm going through compared to that. But on the other hand, it also, I think there's this problem of speech. Like, okay, so I talk more about that, but I'm still talking about such traumas that are being endured by other people from such a distance, as opposed to them having their own voice to speak. Whatever kind of way I'd approximate it, I think in the end, I have to recognize that whatever I have to say and whatever my own experience is, which is valid in its own place, it just is a profoundly different thing than the experiences that many other people in this world are going through.
Were you teaching this semester?
No, I'm actually on sabbatical.
Okay, because I was wondering if you'd had to make that adjustment. When you mentioned the travel, I assumed you were off, but have you heard it all from your colleagues as to how that change has gone in terms of
I haven't heard much. I believe in giving my colleagues a break from me.
Yeah.
In addition to me having a break from regular teaching responsibilities, and they've had a lot to deal with as they've had to suddenly transfer their courses over. My wife is a professor as well, and she wasn't on sabbatical this term, so she had to make the instant transition, and she's just finishing up her term right now and really feeling sort of sadness at what happened to her courses. I mean,
what does she teach?
She teaches religious studies at Seton Hall, and so yeah, both she and her students were dealing with so many different kinds of things. It was really difficult to have the kind of quality experience that she's often had in the latter part of the term. They've all done the best they can, and I think that's true for many of my colleagues too. I myself have had a lot of experience, or a fair amount of experience, teaching online. So it wouldn't have been as much of an adjustment as it was for most of my colleagues who'd never done so. And so anyway, but it's been a really difficult transition, and in many ways I sense that, and you maybe some of your other guests have talked about this who are academics. Schools said, okay, you're teaching online, but that was just a way of saying we're not closed.
Right.
In truth be told, not a whole lot of real education could happen amidst this whole crisis, suddenly shifting to a new platform with no preparation and often very limited resources. So I think it was a placeholder. And I'm really hoping that schools, as they go into the next fall, are able to do a better job with their students. Because it's looking quite a bit like it's going to be pretty hard for a lot of in-person education to happen then, too.
Yeah, there was a columnist I was reading today who said finishing the semester, it was tiring but doable. But at least that was a semester where the students got to meet and be in class and see each other in person, for months before this hit. The idea that you go into a semester where there's that initial interaction never occurs concerns this guy that, it'll be a lot tougher when the students don't know each other from the in-person interaction, and as such, can't do the verbal cues, et cetera, that comes from everybody being on a Zoom screen at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's somewhat true. And when I've taught online, I've often had a in-person reception that was optional for my students so they could meet each other at the beginning of the term, and then we'd interact online the rest of the term. That said, I think when I took courses on how to teach online, they actually taught me certain things I've ended up using in my in-person courses too, which is the importance of consciously establishing social connection at the beginning of a course. And that's something, of course, you have to be extra conscious of when you teach online, but you have to do. Many people don't attend to it enough, even when they're teaching in person. And so I think if one really consciously decides, okay, this is a key goal for me during the first 2 weeks of the term, it can be done and done quite well. And when you've done that from the beginning online, sometimes that carries over more into the online format than if you were dependent on in-person modes to start and then are just wrenched into a completely new format.
Are you supposed to be going back to teaching this fall, or is it a calendar year sabbatical? I have no idea how academia works because I ran far away from it in 1995 and never looked back.
I was scheduled to be on sabbatical in the fall and spend 3 months living in Berlin. My wife is going to be on sabbatical too then, so it was a rare time where our academic schedules met. But we realized in light of this crisis that there was a good chance we'd end up just sheltering in place in some small apartment in Berlin instead of at our house in New York. So my institution and the funding agency in Germany, that the Humboldt Foundation that was giving me the scholarship, both graciously agreed to postpone that till April, May of next year. So I'm coming back to teach in the fall, and I'm actually going to teach my Bible and trauma class online. And then I'll go back on sabbatical next spring and do hopefully a trip to Germany. There are no guarantees, of course, where we'll be even then in April, May. But I'm hoping and thinking the chances are better that we can have a quality experience then than in September, October.
I was going to say a chunk of my day job is spent trying to figure out how we're not just going to discover a vaccine, but actually be able to manufacture and distribute it. So that's this is what keeps me from thinking about that all the time. I get to take these little breaks and check in with past podcast guests, ostensibly to get away from this whole notion. But you keep dragging me back in, Carr. That's what I'm saying. Besides Torah and ancient Mesopotamian myth, what else are you reading?
Well, I'm kind of working on 2 tracks right now. One is a fairly technical project that has to do with delving deep into how ancient scribes and authors used scrolls to record their writings. That is, they of course didn't use computers, nor did they even use books as we know them now, but they recorded all their texts on scrolls. And there's certain things you can do when you're writing a scroll or reading it that you can't do with a book, and vice versa. And I think that knowing more about how ancient scrolls were produced and used could help us understand the formation of the Bible better. So that's one project. And then the other has to do with this sort of relatively recent new discipline that's been emerging in the humanities, critical animal studies, which is looking at how people sort of use literary texts to sort of distinguish humans from other non-human beings. We usually use the term animals, but that animal category is used as a way to sort of other all other beings besides humans as something fundamentally different. And one thing that interested me about my work on Genesis that I just finished was the way in which the biblical creation stories really focus on that issue of defining humans over against animals and placing humans above animals in multiple ways. And really, and that sort of being the first step in sort of teaching humans to dominate others. That is, first it's humans versus animals, then it's men versus women, and Israelites versus Canaanites. And by the end of the story, you know, there are a bunch of different social categories that are created, animals versus humans just being the first one. And so I'm just interested in the way sort of we build those sorts of categories to separate the living world and sort of teach little younger people sort of to that domination is okay by way of animals. And it's sort of a pedagogy of domination, which is not necessarily something everybody always comes to naturally. It's something you have to learn. And so I'm interested in how the Bible's a part of that process.
And it brings us back to Tiger King. I'm just kidding.
No, it does.
It does. I know.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Tiger King is often animal rights is very focused on the factory exploitation of animals for food and other products. And I think that's a very important set of questions to raise. But there's also this other dimension that I hesitate to talk about because people could hate me for it, but of ways in which the more benign uses of animals to satisfy human emotional needs through pets and zoos and other sorts of things. And Tiger King's really looking at more of that side of the equation, and it's heightened because they're wild cats. But I think one could ask some questions about just how we relate to domesticated animals and try to convince ourselves that it's all for their good, which it might be. Who am I to say? But I'm struck by how parallel many of the justifications people have for having pets are to the sorts of justifications people once used for having slaves, and how it was all for their good too.
And it ties into the current moment in addition because of the adoption shelters are running out of animals. People are flocking to get dogs and cats, at least New York area. A friend of mine, in fact, just adopted a cat yesterday because he's losing his mind being at home by himself.
Wow.
Week after week after week.
And, you know, I think these questions are, of course, complicated. You know, if there's a living being that is in an adoption shelter and someone can provide them a good home, I'm not saying, oh, that's bad, you're using
Oh,
them.
yeah. No, I wasn't saying you're condemning the entire institution, but yes, everything that leads up to that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm just sort of the whole industry and the ways we try to think it through. I think, like with many things, we try to convince ourselves that one thing's going on when it really is something somewhat different.
Do you own any pets?
I do not. I grew up with dogs and loved them. But it turned out I was allergic to them. I had sniffles as a kid all the way through and realized it was because of my beloved pets. And my wife has asthma, and so we don't have pets. We take lots of antihistamines when we visit friends who do.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you, I would shudder to ask, but in contact with old friends more so now that you're constrained like this?
Well, like many people, we have this whole new video social life. And that has made possible being in more frequent contact with some friends and family members who we often didn't see. Our son, or my stepson, my wife's son, is in the Rioja region of Spain, and he's been totally confined to his apartment. They're not even allowed more than about 100 meters from the apartment to get groceries once a day. For the week, all the weeks that we've been here. And so we've been in video contact with him very frequently, or a friend in Morocco as well. So that's been precious to have, even as it also starts to sometimes feel a bit hollow, where you just desperately wish to relate to an actual human being.
Yeah.
In person.
As I say, that's what's killing me about this whole process. And again, as you said at the outset, if this is the biggest problem I have, it's really not that big a deal. But yeah, the notion of not being able to sit across a table from someone and have a conversation like you and I did, yeah, it's a different way of getting to know someone, I guess. Have you and your wife figured out the place you want to go when this is, we'll say over, when we're in the next phase where you're able to go out?
Well, because we're going to be doing sort of stepwise going out, I think we really miss her. We miss. Well, I just had a granddaughter born in October, and I haven't seen her in person for I guess it's now 3 months. Because I didn't get to see her before my trip. I saw her just before my trip to Europe, and then I was in Europe, and then I came straight here. So I get to see her through video and pictures every day through this daily app thing. But she hasn't seen me, nor have I gotten to hold her for all that time. And so it's just, I guess I'm really looking forward to seeing them and seeing my stepdaughter, Colleen's daughter, who lives in Maine and works on a farm and delivers food to people there. So she's not able in any way to really isolate, although she's careful. And it's making connections with these family members, I think, that's really high on our list right now.
Gotcha. Portions of scripture that give you particular solace? Or that help you through what we're going through?
I think I was talking earlier about the story of the flood in Genesis. Mm-hmm. And just for folks who are listening, just to review, it says in it, God decides to send a flood, announces it to Noah, tells Noah to build an ark. Noah does it and floats on the ark through the flood and comes out at the other side. Anyway, much as that story was an indirect way, I think, for Israelites to talk about trauma and reassure themselves that such trauma would never happen again. I think, we're experiencing right now that really bad things can happen. And I'm really struck, to get back to your question, with the power of some Jewish traditions. They start in the Zohar and they continue later, which asks the question, why didn't Noah say anything back to God? Mm-hmm. When God announces to Abraham that God's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham objects and says, well, what if there are 50 righteous? And talks God down to 40 and 30 and 20 and 10. And in the end, only, Lot's family gets out. But at least Abraham talked back. And when God, this is all Jewish tradition, but they point out also that when God said God would destroy the Israelites when they built the golden calf, Noah objects and says, what would the Egyptians think? And you made all these promises to these people, and God changes God's mind. But then they point out, okay, so as opposed to Abraham and Moses, Noah, he's just quiet and he never talks back. And what I find powerful, and to your question, solace, I mean, about that Jewish tradition is, you know, if I was to think spiritually about this experience, it would be talking back to God about, you know, what the crap is happening right now to people. What's the point of all this? And there I find power in the Jewish traditions of lament and protest, of figures like Job, who won't stand down and will insist this is not right, what is happening. And so I guess it's those kinds of traditions of protest that I find in the heart of the Bible and in Jewish tradition that I find the most power in right now.
It's interesting because you could take that as a source of despair rather than solace. It's comforting to see that you take it as a positive like that.
Well, I think one has to be careful with religion, because sometimes people react by saying, well, like everything happens for a reason, or, you know, this is all for the good. And of course, we all try to find moments of goodness and to learn what we can out of this experience. I desperately, desperately hope that this experience might prompt people to maybe take science more seriously and work ahead in dealing with the climate crisis. So all that's true, but I think religion often is used to sort of shut people down from what they're feeling and that sort of thing. And the power that I find in biblical laments, which were formed amidst trauma, of course, and these Jewish traditions that questioned why Noah didn't object to what God had planned, is that they provide sort of spiritual resources for people to feel what they feel.
It sounds good to me. David, thanks so much for coming back on, and I hope we're able to get together someday soon. By soon, I mean in the next year or two, because, you know, we are where we are right now.
So it's been a pleasure talking with you, Gil, and very best wishes to you and to everyone who's listening.
Including my dog, who does not resent the whole pet-slave dichotomy.
Good.
Thanks, David. We'll talk soon. Thanks.
Sounds good.
That was David M. Carr. If I was using bumper music for the show, I definitely would have gone with Pets by Porno for Pyros. It's the one about how if aliens come down, they would see us like pets, and I don't know where David's piece is going to lead in terms of understanding how my dog and I get along, but I'm nervous about reading it. Anyway, go check out David's 2014 book, Holy Resilience, The Bible's Traumatic Origins. It's from Yale University Press. I'll have a link to it in the show and episode notes. It's a really impressive work of scholarship and interpretation. It stuck with me 4 years after reading it, and you guys know how many books I go through for the show, so that's a recommendation as far as I'm concerned. Now, you can find David's site at David M. Carr with more info about his book and his other work. He's got some social media accounts, but isn't active on any of them. You can drop him a line directly from the site, and that's David. The letter M is in man. Carr is Carr. So davidmcarr.com. And we'll be back tomorrow with another COVID check-in. I recorded it yesterday. It's a fascinatingly weird one. I was expecting things to go very differently, much as I expected with this one not going into Tiger King. So if you want to send me a little update to read on the air about how you're doing, or you have something you want to share with listeners in a conversation, let me know and we'll set something up. I'm at groth18, GROTH18 @gmail.com. You can find my contact info at my websites, vmspod.com and chimeraobscura.com/VM. And you can find a link to the COVID-19 sessions at both of those sites with all of these daily episodes. I managed to do 29 episodes in 30 days in April, and I'm kicking myself over missing that one day, but I'll get by. I'm not sure if I'm going to keep this up as a daily thing going forward. We'll see where it goes. I'm not putting a whole lot of OCD restrictions on what I'm doing. Anyway, if you want to make sure you're keeping up with all of this stuff, you can just subscribe to the Virtual Memories show via iTunes, Spotify, or other podcatchers. The RSS feed is on chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can make sure you get every episode that way. And in the before time, I always recorded these shows in person, but now I'm using Zencastr.com to record remotely. If you're interested in that service, it's spelled Zencastr, so no final E. The pro level for Zencastr is $20 a month, but I'm doing fine. I make a decent living. I've got Patreon support for the show. I don't spend money anymore on parking and tolls and subway trips and coffee and occasionally pie, depending on where the guest lives. So all of those in-person expenses are gone. If you can spare anything, don't give it to me. Give it to the artists, writers, and other creative people in need. You can go to their Patreons, GoFundMes, Kickstarters, Indiegogos, tip jars, whatever it is. Show them some support. Give to charities, your local food bank, other places, anything that will help people in need right now. My whole barometer of being a good person is if somebody's in need or somebody needs help and you help them, you're good. If you don't, you're bad. Anyway, I'm Gil Roth. It is May 1st, 2020, and this was a bonus episode of my Virtual Memories Show podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Keep the conversation going, stay safe, and wash your damn hands.